Hello YouTube. Something that comes up in a lot of debates in philosophy is the notion of the burden of proof. One side will claim that the other bears a burden of proof. So the assumption here is that there are certain positions that are kind of default positions. We assume these positions to be true until the opponent has demonstrated that they are incorrect. We don't need to give a positive argument, it's up to our opponent to give the argument against our position. All we need to do is refute their arguments, and that's enough. We've made our case. So C.M. Lorkowski in the article Atheism defines the burden of proof as follows. The burden of proof is a dialectical tool used to help determine whose job it is to provide further evidence for their position. It tells us that should the debate end now, admitting no further evidence or argument, the position that has the burden of proof should be rejected in favour of the other position. So there's some sort of presumption in favour of one position, and the opposing position has the job of dislodging that presumption. Another point that seems to follow from this is that if the arguments for our respective positions are of roughly equal quality, then the position that bears the burden of proof loses. So you know, if I bear the burden of proof, it's not enough that I provide an argument. I must provide a significantly stronger argument than my opponent. Because, you know, when I bear the burden of proof and the arguments are a draw, my opponent wins. That's the basic idea. So, the question is, do philosophical positions ever bear the burden of proof? And if so, how do we determine who bears the burden of proof? So let's look through some arguments for assigning burden of proof in philosophy. Well, the first class of arguments are prudential arguments. In the article Prove It, the burden of proof claim in science versus pseudoscience disputes, Massimo Pigliucci and Martin Baudry distinguish between the prudential burden of proof and the evidential burden of proof. So we'll look here at the prudential burden of proof. Here's how Pigliucci and Baudry define this distinction. They say that the prudential burden of proof is applicable when there are cost asymmetries in arriving at two judgments about whatever matter is under dispute, whereas the evidential burden of proof applies when there are no such cost asymmetries involved. The classic case of the prudential burden of proof is in the criminal trial. When a person is accused of a crime, we say that the burden of proof is on the prosecution. There's a default assumption that the defendant is innocent, and it's up to the prosecution to provide sufficient evidence to dislodge that assumption. And I mean, for criminal cases, we require that the prosecution prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. So that puts a pretty significant burden on the prosecution. Why is this burden of proof claim appropriate? So a couple of points are raised by Keith Burgess Jackson in his article Rethinking the Presumption of Atheism. So he points out, well, first of all, in the courtroom, there is an urgency to the decision. We have to decide whether the defendant is innocent or guilty within a reasonable time frame, because, you know, we want innocent defendants to be released and not to be troubled with an endless trial. We want guilty defendants to be punished, and in any case, there are costs of running a court case. So, you know, we don't want the debate to continue for decades, and that's a reason for specifying a default position, right? Like, if the burden of overcoming the default position is not met, then the matter is brought to a close. So, you know, one side is going to have the burden of proof. Which side? Well, here we can say, you know, look, the judgment in a court has significant practical consequences. Obviously, there's the immediate impact on the defendant, because if found guilty, she will suffer significant loss of liberty, so her interests are at stake. There's also an impact on the rest of society, because I can think, you know, what kind of society would I want to live in? I know that I may be accused of a crime in the future, and if that happens, I would want some system for protecting my interests. I don't want to live in a world where it's too easy to convict people of serious crimes, because that puts me at risk. You know, when a person is accused of a crime, there are two types of error we might make. We might convict an innocent person, or we might let a guilty person go free. And the vast majority of us think convicting innocents is far worse than failing to convict the guilty. You know, it's better to let 10 guilty people go free than to imprison one guilty person, than to punish one innocent person. So the point of placing the burden of proof on the prosecution is to minimise these worse errors. If we changed our minds about this, if we decided that failing to convict the guilty was far worse than convicting the innocent, well, we'd probably say that the burden of proof lies with the defence, not the prosecution. So it's the sort of shared values concerning which outcomes are worse that set the burden of proof. Okay, in the criminal trial then, we have a prudential burden of proof. The burden applies to the prosecution because we think it's worse to convict an innocent person than to free a guilty person. Now, the notion of a prudential burden of proof is relatively uncontroversial. It's quite reasonable to say, well, yeah, I mean, when we're in a situation where we have to answer a question, and there's a higher cost in being wrong about one particular way of answering the question, then the burden is placed on that answer, right? And so we sort of assume the other answer as a default. The defendant is assumed innocent until proven guilty. Okay, well, one thought here then is that all legitimate burden of proof claims are prudential burdens of proof. There is no evidential burden of proof, right? A burden of proof only applies in these cases where there is a cost asymmetry. Could we apply the prudential burden of proof in philosophical arguments? Well, this is less obvious, right? Because in philosophical debates, there is no urgency. I could spend a lifetime working through the arguments for and against a philosophical position, and some people actually do this with their lives. There's no need for the debate to reach a resolution. Moreover, in philosophical debates, there are often no practical consequences. It doesn't really make any practical difference whether I conceive of moral norms as stance independent, or whether I think that the world was created by God, or whether I'm a, dualist or materialist or whatever, right? There's no kind of immediate practical problems that might be created by having any particular answer here. So, it's not quite so obvious that there's going to be a role for prudential burden of proof. But perhaps more can be said here, because philosophical positions do have practical consequences sometimes, right? So sometimes there may well be cost asymmetries. A classic example of this kind of thing is Pascal's wager. Pascal famously argued that the cost of failing to believe in God when there is a God is much higher than the cost of believing in God when there is no God. So here's the sort of payoffs for different beliefs in different situations, right? Suppose you believe in God. Well, if God exists, you go to heaven, whereas if God doesn't exist, there's just nothing, right? So you don't lose anything by believing in God. I don't know, maybe you have to make a few sacrifices in order to act in accordance with religious requirements, but when you're dead, you're just dead, and that's it. You're not losing anything major with believing in God. But if God exists, you get the infinite reward in heaven. On the other hand, suppose you don't believe in God. Well, then if God exists, you're going to hell. You're going to be subject to eternal torture. That's an infinitely bad loss. Whereas if God doesn't exist, you haven't gained anything. When you die, you'll just cease to exist. So being correct about God's non-existence doesn't bring you any practical benefits. And so if this reasoning is correct, then, hey, it looks like there's a pretty powerful prudential burden of proof on the atheist, right? So we should take theism as the default position. It's going to require some pretty powerful arguments to dislodge that, right? Given the risks and rewards here. Another example that people might argue is with the realism-anti-realism debate in metaethics. It might be argued that belief in moral facts plays an important role in motivating people to act in accordance with moral norms. If people were to convert to moral anti-realism, they would end up seeing our moral commitments as little different from aesthetic tastes. Moral norms play an important role in regulating behaviour, promoting peace and cooperation. In a population of anti-realists, moral norms would be less effective at serving this function. On the other hand, if there are no moral norms, if there are no moral facts, the incorrect belief in moral facts doesn't seem to have any negative consequences. Indeed, it seems to have positive consequences because it makes people more likely to follow moral norms and, so more likely to kind of act in ways that most of us value, like promoting peace and cooperation and so on. So there's a prudential presumption in favour of moral realism. Third example, animal rights. Some people argue that animals have a moral right to life, others deny this. But we might say, well, look, it's much worse to kill an entity that has a right to life than it is to fail to kill an entity that doesn't have a right to life. So here's the kind of decision matrix. If we believe that it's okay to kill animals, but we are wrong and they have a right to life, we are perpetuating an awful moral evil. It might even be comparable to the Holocaust. If we believe that it's not okay to kill animals, even though animals don't have a right to life, I mean, there's no particular loss there. I suppose our food sources will be a little more restricted, but there's plenty of vegan options available. So you can sort of see these differential costs, right? Like if we're killing animals, there's the minor benefit, right, of the tasty food, right? But there's potentially the massive evil of killing things that have a right to life. So given these differential costs, we should say that there's a presumption in favour of animal rights. If you want to claim it's okay to kill animals, the burden of proof is on you to demonstrate that. So that's the idea of a prudential burden of proof, and maybe this does apply to some philosophical debates. Now, let's note a couple of problems with this approach. So first thing is that although there may well be practical consequences associated with particular philosophical positions, often there's no agreement on what these consequences will be. So you find this with the debate around Pascal's wager. If traditional Christianity is true, then believers go to heaven and unbelievers go to hell. But unless I'm already a Christian, I'm not going to accept that picture of God. Because I can say, well, maybe there is a God, but he doesn't care about whether people believe in him. Or maybe there is a God, but God is a militant evidentialist who will send all people to hell who believe without sufficient evidence, right? I mean, that strikes me as just as plausible as the Christian God, right? Like, it literally does. I see no reason why I should prefer one image of God to the other. So if you apply the militant evidentialist God to Pascal's wager, you'd say that the prudential burden of proof is on the theist. Now notice that this sort of situation is quite different to what you find in the courtroom, because there both the prosecution and the defence can agree that they agree on what the outcomes are. They agree on what the consequences are, right? Like, if the defendant is found innocent, she'll be released. If found guilty, she'll be punished in accordance with the law. So, it's a bit different here, right? Like, we have to kind of get into the philosophical arguments in order to figure out what these practical consequences are even supposed to be. A second problem with the prudential burden of proof is that, as Pigliucci and Bowdry note, the same topic can be approached in both ways. It can be approached in terms of either the prudential or the evidential burden of proof. Pigliucci and Bowdry give the example of trying to determine whether some food additive is safe for human consumption. Well, you can take this as a purely scientific question, in which case there's not going to be any cost in arriving at any particular judgment. It doesn't make any difference just in itself what conclusion is drawn at the end of a scientific paper. So if there is a burden of proof on either side here, it would be the evidential burden of proof. But then, when we ask a question like, is a food additive safe for human consumption? Well, this might be a matter of trying to figure out public policy. And obviously there are going to be cost asymmetries in getting the wrong answers there. It's much worse to allow a harmful food additive to be used than it is to block a safe additive. So we say that the burden is on those who favour the use of the additive to prove that it's not harmful. It's not enough to say, well, there's no evidence that it is harmful. You actually have to do the studies, gather evidence, and demonstrate its safety. Now, the point of this then is that whether there is a prudential or evidential burden of proof depends on what we're going to do once we have an answer to our question. And the trouble is that in many philosophical debates, it looks like our aim is just to evaluate particular beliefs. We're just trying to figure out which beliefs are true or which beliefs are epistemically justified. We're not trying to shape public policy, at least not directly. So our question might be simply, is moral realism true? Right? It's a different question whether we should encourage the general population to think in moral realist terms. I might conclude that moral realism is true, but for prudential reasons, I think that moral realism should be promoted outside the philosophy classroom. I think, it's a good idea to bring up children as moral realists. Or I might ask, do animals have a right to life? I might conclude that animals don't have a right to life, but for prudential reasons we should act as if they do. So it's similar with the food additive, right? There's a purely theoretical question: is this additive safe for human consumption? And then it's a further question whether we should actually use that additive. And the prudential burden of proof only applies there. I can conclude that the additive is not harmful, but given the costs of being wrong, we should continue to act as though it is, at least until further evidence comes in. So with this point in mind, it looks like applying the prudential burden of proof to at least many philosophical debates is just going to miss the point of what those debates are trying to do. All right then, well, so that was the prudential burden of proof. That's the burden of proof that applies when there are cost asymmetries. So let's turn to the evidential burden of proof, the idea that there is an evidential burden of proof on some philosophical views. Okay, so these are reasons for burden of proof that do not appeal to cost asymmetries. What then could justify this? Well, here's one idea. We might say that there is a general burden of proof on belief, no matter what the belief in question is. The burden of proof is on the person who is making the positive claim. If you make an assertion, you need to be prepared to back it up. So on this view, both P and not P bear the burden of proof, and the default position is skepticism or suspension of judgment between P and not P. So both the atheist and the theist, both the moral realist and the moral anti-realist, both the idealist and the physicalist, both the animal rights advocate and the anthropocentrist, they all bear the burden of proof. Anybody making a positive claim, it's suspension of judgment is the default. Anyone making a positive claim bears the burden of proof. Incidentally, when I say atheist, just to clarify, I mean the person who believes that there is no God. I know that the term is sometimes used in a more general way to just refer to people who are not theists. That's not how I'm using the term here. I'm using it to mean the person who believes that there is no God. Just clarifying that, because I'm going to use that term later on as well. And I just realised I should probably clarify that. Right. So that's the idea here. Now we might reason like this. We might say, look, if we are to hold a belief on something, then that belief should be justified. Some grounds must be given for it. If I can't provide grounds for my belief, well, I seem to be accepting that there is no reason for my belief. And holding beliefs without reason is epistemically irresponsible. After all, the vast majority of possible beliefs are false. Indeed, perhaps the vast majority of beliefs that people have actually held have been false. So the initial position is suspension of judgment, and then if you're going to stake out some belief, right, you need to have a reason for it. Here's a worry about this line of reasoning. So it's worth noting that suspension of judgment is itself a kind of, it's itself a sort of positive position. It's a considered position, and as such, it arguably should be justified through philosophical argument. So we need to distinguish between the sort of philosophical skeptic and the person who simply makes no claim one way or the other. So let's take the theism versus atheism debate. Verity has never considered the question of God. She's been brought up in a society that has no religious practices, and she has no knowledge of religious concepts. So Verity can't yet even conceptualize the debate between theists and atheists. She doesn't hold a position. On the other hand, Sidney is a philosopher who works in philosophy of religion. He has spent his life considering the arguments for God's existence, and he finds himself unsure. He thinks, there's good arguments for it, good arguments against it, so he suspends judgment. Now, neither Verity nor Sidney holds a belief about God's existence. Neither is an atheist or a theist. Even so, it seems like Sidney is making some sort of positive commitment that Verity is not. Sidney is going to think something like, we ought to suspend judgment on God's existence, or it is reasonable to suspend judgment on God's existence, or maybe just, I suspend judgment on God's existence. Verity doesn't do this. She has no concept of God at all. So Sidney has a sort of positive position here. And I mean, notice also, of course, that another way to see this is that people often have to reason their way into skeptical positions, because in practice, when we first begin doing philosophy, we start by holding various beliefs. philosophical inquiry may lead us to give up those beliefs, obviously, but, we're all brought up with a particular set of views and commitments, so when we suspend judgment, right, that's something, that's not like the default, it's something that some people do and some do not, and that can be argued for or against. So if we say that the burden of proof is on the person making the claim, then arguably this is a burden that will be shouldered by everybody. It will be shouldered by all positions, and that includes the skeptical positions. But in that case, of course, if the burden of proof is shouldered by all the positions, then the concept of burden of proof isn't really doing any work here. We could just as well say that nobody has the burden of proof. Okay, so that's it. So that was the idea that there might be like a burden on belief in general. So a second view is that the burden of proof is set by common sense or intuition. Philosophers often judge their theories against common sense. The assumption is that our common sense beliefs, our everyday beliefs, have a sort of special status, so that if a philosophical position is in tension with common sense, then this position bears the burden of proof. So this is quite a common thing to hear from moral realists, for example. Moral realism, they claim, is just part of common sense. If you think of propositions like you ought not to torture children or it is good to give to charity, these propositions strike us as obviously true. That's just part of how we experience the world and how we experience our interactions with other people. Like if I was to see somebody torturing a child, right, I would immediately it would present itself to me as an evil act, right, and I would be driven to stop it. So the common sense world is a world of moral properties, moral rights, duties, virtues. So as David Brink says in his book Moral Realism, we begin as tacit cognitivists and realists about ethics. Moral realism should be our meta-ethical starting point, and we should give it up only if it does involve unacceptable metaphysical and epistemological commitments. And so no positive argument for moral realism is really required, because moral realism is just common sense, and it's something that we all initially accept, and that's just how the world appears to us. It's up to anti-realists to show what's wrong with it. It's up to anti-realists to dislodge our moral beliefs. One way to think about this, I suppose, is that common sense is, I guess, the kind of initial position. So I noted in the previous section on the burden of proof of belief, right, on skepticism, that we all start out doing philosophy by holding various beliefs, and these beliefs will, by and large, be common sense beliefs. So I believe, for instance, that I have two hands, that the sun will rise tomorrow, that torturing children is morally wrong, that induction is a reliable tool, etc. That's where pretty much everybody starts, right? There's just these certain basic beliefs that we pretty much all agree on, and so then we need arguments for giving up our initial position. It's not enough just to point out that common sense beliefs might be wrong, because any belief might be wrong, right? Some positive reason for thinking that they are wrong must be provided, and the reason for thinking of common sense this way, I suppose, is just what's the alternative? We can only criticize beliefs by testing them against other beliefs, or at least against other propositions that we're taking for granted for the purposes of the inquiry. None of us can strip away all of our beliefs and start from scratch. So Otto Neurath once put it, we are like sailors who, on the open sea, must reconstruct their ship, but are never able to start afresh from the bottom. Where a beam is taken away, a new one must at once be put there, and for this, the rest of the ship is used as support. In this way, by using the old beams and driftwood, the ship can be shaped entirely anew, but only by gradual reconstruction. So in any inquiry that we make into the world, we're going to take certain beliefs for granted, and really we have no choice but to begin our inquiries with whatever beliefs we initially find ourselves with. Now, of course, many of us have conflicting beliefs, right? This is one of the reasons that we're motivated to start inquiring in the first place, because we hold different beliefs about the world, and that leads to arguments, etc. But For those beliefs that are just part of common sense, we have something at least close to a universal starting point. So the burden is on the position that conflicts with that universal starting point. All right, so there's a lot to say about common sense, but actually I mean, I've already said much of it in previous videos. I have a video on More's response to skepticism and on intuition that are worth checking out. I will link them in a comment below. So for the purpose of this video, though, I'll briefly note a few points. So first of all, even granting that common sense forms the starting point of our inquiries, it's not obvious why this would impose any burden of proof on alternative positions. If I state an alternative position, which, you know, is coherent and is empirically adequate, and if I state an alternative position that has the sort of same theoretical virtues as the common sense position, well, we could just use that as the starting point of our inquiry instead, right? So it's not like we have to use common sense as to kind of guide our inquiries. It's not like we have to use it as a starting point. So why would there be a burden of proof on other potential starting points? That's not obvious. Second, common sense has, of course, often been wrong. Science has revealed a world completely at odds with people's intuitions about how the world works. The Copernican revolution, general relativity, Darwinian natural selection, the germ theory of disease, quantum mechanics. You know, the common sense beliefs at the time these theories were proposed turned out to be mistaken. So common sense doesn't seem to have any special access to the way the world is on a deeper level, and we don't expect other disciplines to conform to common sense. Theoretical physicists aren't going to assume that common sense is the default position. So why should it be different for philosophers? Third problem is that often it's not all that obvious what the common sense position actually is. So I talked about moral realism and how moral realists often say that their position is common sense. Well, you know, it's true that people make moral judgments, right? Say the judgment that it's wrong to torture children. If you asked people, is it wrong to torture children? I'm sure the vast majority would say yes. But it's much less obvious that people conceive of these judgments as expressing stance-independent moral facts. There seems to be at least a substantial minority of people who hold explicitly anti-realist views when they're asked. I have a video with Lance Bush where we talk about the evidence that lay people are not universally realists. Many lay people are anti-realists, or they seem, to have anti-realist inclinations. Many of them probably don't have any determinate position on metaethics at all, and probably don't conceive of the metaethical debate in anything like the way that professional philosophers do. It takes a lot of philosophical training to even understand what the different metaethical positions are. So it's kind of hard to see how any particular position could be favoured by common sense. We'd probably find a similar phenomenon in many other philosophical debates. If you look at dualism versus materialism about the mind, or different positions on free will, or utilitarianism versus deontology versus virtue ethics, or physicalism versus idealism about the external world, and so on, I suspect that laypersons would often not have a determinate view, and where they do have determinate views, they won't universally favour any specific philosophical position. At least that seems at least plausible, right? It's a topic for empirical research, but that seems at least plausible. So even if we accept that common sense sets the burden of proof, that may not be applicable in many philosophical debates, right? And certainly it would be up to the person making the appeal to common sense to provide the empirical evidence that it is, in fact, the common sense position. All right, a third idea is that burden of proof is determined by well-established background knowledge. We might think of this as a development of the appeal to common sense. Our common sense beliefs form a set of naive theories of the world, but over the millennia, we have refined these theories. What we have today is an extremely sophisticated, systematic set of empirically successful theories. The well-established theories of mature science. When we do philosophy, this should be our starting point. If a philosophical theory is incompatible with or in tension with well-established scientific theories, then it bears the burden of proof. It has less initial plausibility. Consider, for instance, substance dualism, the claim that mind and matter are distinct substances. Arguably, this is hard to square with our modern scientific picture of the world, or at least there are various puzzles that it raises. So first of all, this mental substance is not described by any of our sciences. So if there is a distinct mental substance, why haven't we found it? I mean, like, we've found so many other things, like, for instance, neutrinos. Neutrinos are incredibly hard to detect. They interact very rarely with other forms of matter. The average neutrino would pass through a piece of lead a light year thick. So very hard to detect. We've managed to find them. Why haven't we found the mental substance? I mean, especially given that the mental substance, why would it be so hard to detect? After all, it's playing an important role in, generating consciousness and directing our behavior. This seems like the sort of thing that we should have been able to find by now. Yet despite this, despite all of the sophisticated instruments and theories that we have for illuminating ever deeper parts of reality, there's not a hint of this mental substance, and it's not postulated in any empirical theory. Second, we now believe that all species are products of gradual evolution from single-celled ancestors. At what point in this process did the mental substance arise? When was the mental substance attached to biological organisms? It looks like there's going to be some arbitrary point in evolutionary history where, organisms, they have no mental substance, but then one day, an act of reproduction occurs and, boom, there's a mental substance in the offspring. How and why did this happen? And how could the evolutionary process have produced this strange new substance which seems to have no adaptive value? So the argument would go, substance dualism is hard to square with our background knowledge. That puts a burden of proof on the substance dualist. Okay, so a difficulty with this kind of argument is, again, there's likely to be a lot of debate about whether the position in question is in fact incompatible with our background knowledge. With respect to substance dualism, well, philosophers have come up with more sophisticated versions of the position that are designed to avoid the sort of problems I just noted. Actually, there's a nice article by William Lycan called Giving Dualism Its Due, where he says, actually, I mean, Lycan is a materialist, but he's sort of playing devil's advocate, and he says, actually, these sorts of objections are pretty easily met. And meeting these objections does mean changing the theory slightly, but, that's what happens with all theories when they face objections. In the same way, if you were to look at very early versions of identity theory about the mind or functionalism about the mind, well, they are also going to be incompatible with our more sophisticated background knowledge today. Early identity theorists used to say things like, pain is the firing of C fibers. Well, if you actually look at the neuroscience of pain, no, it isn't. That just doesn't work. As we learn more about neuroscience and comparative psychology and so on, other theories of the mind have had to be modified too. When the claim is made that a philosophical theory is incompatible with background knowledge, well, defenders of that theory are probably just going to reject this. They won't accept that burden. They'll say, no, we have more sophisticated forms of this theory, right, that are perfectly consistent with, with modern scientific findings. So substance dualists are probably going to say that about substance dualism. So you're not going to find any sort of agreement, at least, that there's a burden of proof in this respect. All right, a final idea about evidential burden of proof that's quite popular is that the evidential burden of proof is determined by simplicity. The theory that is more complex shoulders the burden of proof. This is expressed most famously in Occam's razor. Do not multiply entities without necessity. Similarly, Isaac Newton once said, no more causes of natural things should be admitted than are both true and sufficient to explain their phenomena. So these are sort of statements of a simplicity criterion. If your theory is postulating more types of things in the world, then you need to provide a justification for that. Let's take metaethics. Moral anti-realists sometimes accuse moral realists of an inflationary ontology because moral realists postulate stance-independent moral properties. There's nothing equivalent to that in the anti-realists' worldview. And these moral properties raise a host of difficult questions. Which entities have moral status and why? What is the relation between moral properties and natural properties? How do we come to know the moral facts? Why do the moral facts have practical significance to us? Now, of course, moral realists have answers to these questions, but the answers will involve populating the world with normative properties. And that is... Well, the argument would go that's less simple, right? The theory it has sort of lower simplicity, and as a result, the realist bears the burden of proof. Okay, an immediate problem with the simplicity criterion is that it turns out there's a whole load of ways of defining simplicity, and whether theory A is simpler than theory B probably depends on the definition we use. So I am not going to go through all of these, but I've listed some examples of simplicity criteria that have been used in science and philosophy. I've taken these from the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy. These are just some. There's a whole bunch of others. So consider moral realism again. The moral realist might say, well, look, okay, moral realism, postulates these stance-independent moral facts, but it also explains a diverse range of phenomena. It explains our moral intuitions. It explains the convergence of moral values over time. We can use moral properties to explain people's behaviour, to explain why people did the things that they have done. Like I can explain why Hitler behaved the way he did by saying that he had a corrupted moral character, etc. So, there's all of these things that we can use moral properties and moral facts to explain. So actually, in terms of unification, right, the unification criterion, which is explaining a wider and more diverse range of phenomena, well, hey, moral realism turns out to be simpler, right, than moral anti-realism in that respect. Or so a moral realist might argue. Moreover, we can point out that whether a theory is simple according to these criteria often depends on background assumptions. So I would say that the moral realist has an inflationary ontology because she is postulating these stance-independent normative facts. So I'm appealing there to some sort of ontological parsimony. I can say, well, the anti-realist sort of has a smaller number of independent kinds of entities, processes, or events. But then the realist might make a sort of companions in guilt argument. She'd say, well, I already believe, I, as a moral realist, right, I already believe that there are, for instance, stance-independent epistemic norms, stance-independent facts about what we ought to believe, about what we're justified in believing or rational in believing. So when I go on to postulate stance-independent moral facts, that's just another type of normative fact. So there's no loss of ontological parsimony, and actually, the realist might continue. It looks like a whole bunch of anti-realists believe that there are stance-independent facts about epistemic norms as well. Not every anti-realist, right? Some of us are really crazy and we just deny stance-independent normativity in general. But if you talk to someone like Richard Joyce, well, he seems to be okay with stance-independent epistemic norms. So, there's not a moral realism compared to that is not sort of lower on ontological parsimony. So it's going to be very difficult to sort of judge simplicity for these reasons. So C.M. Lorkowski in the article Atheism suggests that there are simplicity criteria that don't depend on background knowledge. He says that simplicity should be judged simply by the number of unique claims made by a position. And we don't need to have any knowledge about the arguments for or against a position or its relation to other positions in order to judge this. So the idea is that the higher the number of unique claims that are made by a position, the more ways there are for that position to be incorrect, so the lower the prior probability of the position. And that means that the burden of proof lies with that position. Here's a simple example, right? Let's take these two positions. Position A is that grass is blue. Position B is snow is white and the sun is heated by nuclear fusion and Frank Zappa wrote Joe's Garage. Now, of course, we actually know that A is false and B is true. But imagine if you're looking at this from the point of view of somebody who just doesn't know anything about either of those propositions. Well, we can see that B is making more claims. So If we know nothing about either proposition and we had to bet on which one was false, we'd probably bet on B, because there's just more ways for it to be false. There's more ways for it to go wrong. And Lorkowski says we can apply the same idea in philosophical debates. In particular, he looks at the God debate. So let's take theism. The standard theist position makes several unique claims. It claims that the natural world exists, at least one supernatural entity exists. This entity has affected the natural world in various ways. This entity has attributes such as omnipotence, omniscience, omnibenevolence, and so on. The naturalist position makes two claims. The natural world exists, and nothing outside the natural world affects the natural world. So only the second claim here is unique, right? Both the naturalist and the theist agree the natural world exists, so that's not a unique claim. They both agree on that. The naturalist makes one unique claim, the theist makes a whole bunch of unique claims. So theism bears the burden of proof, because there's more ways for theism to be incorrect. We can take for granted the shared assumption that there's a natural world. In that case, as Lorkowski says, the only way the naturalist's position can be incorrect is if there is at least one supernatural entity that has affected the natural world. The theistic position, by contrast, can be incorrect in numerous ways. If it turns out that there's no supernatural entity, if it turns out that there is a supernatural creator, but this creator doesn't have properties like omnipotence, if it turns out that there are many creators of equal power, and so on. Now, so that's the idea, right? But we might think, well, there's still going to be some difficulties here with specifying, number of unique claims in a sort of neutral way, in a way that everybody can agree on. The theist might argue, for instance, that belief in the natural world commits us to a necessary being on the basis of, for instance, the contingency argument. So the naturalists claim that there is a natural world and only a natural world is, from the theist's point of view, just going to look confused or incoherent, because the theist might say, once we properly understand the nature of the natural world, once we understand that it is contingent and that all contingent things have some sufficient cause for their existence, etc., we see that a necessary being must be postulated. A necessary being is a commitment of belief in the natural world. So naturalism, from that point of view, looks incoherent. And of course, it doesn't really make sense to assess the relative simplicity of incoherent positions. Of course, at this point, we're getting into the direct arguments for and against theism. Like if we're talking about the contingency argument, right, we're now just talking about arguments for and against theism. But the point is that in the absence of these arguments, it's hard to say how many unique claims each position makes. Because imagine if everybody accepted the contingency arguments for a necessary being. Imagine if it was just, universally accepted that, the natural world commits us to necessary being. Well, again, naturalism would seem incoherent or confused. So by analogy, right, take these two positions, right? Position A is that water exists and is composed of H2O. Position B is water exists and does not compose into any other substances. Well, it doesn't seem as though position B is simpler than the first or makes fewer unique claims than the first, because water is just, we would say, well, water is just what H2O molecules do in certain conditions. Or we might say that water is just what H2O molecules are in certain conditions. To affirm the existence of water is to affirm the existence of H2O. You can't have one without the other. Similarly, if we endorsed the contingency argument, we would see belief in the natural world as involving a commitment to a necessary being. So arguably, this sort of way of sort of specifying number of claims made by a position isn't going to work in the absence of considering the arguments for and against those positions. So that might be a problem. All right then. Before we end, I want to note a general dilemma for burden of proof claims in philosophical argument. Suppose we claim that the defender of some position P, bears the burden of proof. Well, now we can ask, what is it that justifies this? So I can always ask, well, why does P bear the burden of proof? I mean, if I happen to believe P, right, why should I think it bears any special burden? And here we have a dilemma. So the first option is that the justification for the claim that P bears the burden of proof is an argument to the effect that P is false, or an argument to the effect that P is unjustified, or that P is less probable, or that we should have a lower degree of belief in P, or whatever, right? So it's basically our justification for the burden of proof claim is some argument to the effect that P is false or unjustified. Second option is it's not, right? The justification for the burden of proof claim doesn't tell us anything about whether P is false or improbable or unjustified. And so there's two options here, and both of them are problematic. So let's say we take the first option. The reason why we shift the burden of proof onto P is because P is, false, unjustified. We have an argument that P is false or unjustified. Well, in that case, don't we just have a direct argument against P? Right? I mean, it looks like what we've done here is just given an argument for denying P. But then talk of burden of proof is redundant. The issue isn't that P has some special argumentative burden that it's failed to deliver on. It's just there's a straightforward argument against P. So suppose we say, for example, P bears the burden of proof because it violates Occam's razor, right? It multiplies entities without necessity, and positions that multiply entities without necessity tend to be false. Well, why are we talking about burden of proof here? Right? If positions that multiply entities without necessity tend to be false, we just have an argument against P. Or if it turns out that P is incompatible with a well-established scientific theory, like how we might argue that substance dualism is incompatible with evolutionary theory, well, that's just a straightforward argument against the position, right? There's no need to invoke the burden of proof. And it's worth noting that in practice, the reasons that some philosophers cite in justifying burden of proof claims will be cited by other philosophers as direct arguments for particular positions. You can see this with principles like Occam's razor. Some say that Occam's razor lays the burden of proof on moral realism. Others say it is just straightforwardly a reason to reject moral realism. Some say that common sense lays the burden of proof on moral anti-realism. Others appeal to common sense as a direct argument against anti-realism. So I think that if we're taking this sort of route to justify the burden of proof claim, it's not clear why wouldn't this just be an argument against the position? All right, the second option. Suppose the justification for the burden of proof claim is not an argument for thinking that P is false or unjustified or improbable. Well, then we can ask, okay, but why would it bear the burden of proof then? Why would it have? So to believe a proposition is to take that proposition to be true, and when we do philosophy, we're trying to figure out what's true and what's false. So if we haven't said anything about the truth or probability or justification status of a proposition, why would it have any special argumentative burden? I mean, it's just not obvious why anybody should care. Why the defenders of P should care about this if it's not a claim that P is false or unjustified or whatever. So that's the dilemma, right? We're either giving a direct argument against the position, or we're just not saying anything about whether the position is acceptable. And it's not entirely clear then what role burden of proof claims are going to have. So that's that's just something to sort of bear in mind when we think through the sort of reasons we might have for saying that certain philosophical positions bear a burden of proof, right? It's just not obvious what that's doing, or at least this dilemma is worth kind of keeping in mind when we try to give justifications for burden of proof claims. Okay, that's everything. Thanks for watching.